I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the war in Ukraine, the European Green Deal, and what this might all mean for the cities that we are interested in. So I will have several different slides here. I see my computer jumped a little too fast here. So the Russian war on the Ukraine is going to have major implications for energy and climate politics throughout. And I have Germany in the title here, as well as Europe and Israel, because I was just in Israel and gave a similar talk. And what you see with the presentation is that we have a very high dependency on imports from Russia of crude oil, of solid fuel, of natural gas. And the dependency level, it impacts a lot of what we're interested in here with the Powell project, with the focus on emissions, because of course our dependency shows how heavily Europe is also dependent on fossil fuel energy. You see this a little bit here. This graph shows you both 2019 and 2020 imports from different countries. The United States is a smaller player, but will become a bigger player. United Kingdom and Nigeria and Qatar and Algeria, all the smaller countries in terms of where the European Union imports its natural gas. Very dominant are Russia and Norway, and the role of Norway here will also get bigger in the coming years. So European countries, the dependency on Russian gas is quite different country to country. We see North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Moldova, Finland, Latvia as 90% or more dependent on Russian gas. But also middle-level countries in terms of their dependency, Bulgaria, Germany, Italy, Poland, France, even France, it's getting 24% of its gas supply from Russia in 2020. This, of course, has already changed. There are other things that are changing. So soon after the war broke out, the negotiations began in Europe about what to do with fossil fuel dependency, and the fact that this dependency has been supporting the Russian buildup of its military and has, of course, helped to fuel the war in the Ukraine. So the European Union's first response was to stop its coal imports. This was agreed upon on the 5th of April. Europe was importing about 45% of the coal it used. And of course, many European countries have agreed to a coal phase out, but that coal phase out for most countries was still 10 years or so into the future. So this is going to speed up a shift, one, in terms of where we get coal from, but two, also with the dependency on coal. Something else that we've seen is that just prior to the breakout of the war, gas storage levels, especially in Germany, the biggest importer in terms of actual volume, were at a historic low. And we now, of course, think that this had something to do with Russian preparations for the war, that there would be a high dependency, and the assumption was that that dependency would mean that Europe would be weak in terms of resisting the developments in the Ukraine. So this has been in the visor of the European Union, and it's leading to a change in the politics around gas. So you know, of course, that we have been importing gas from Russia via various pipelines. Here on the map, you see this green line. This was the planned Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. And you see that it circumvents the Ukraine. The idea was started already, almost 20 years ago. to develop this pipeline. And it actually had been completed at the end of last year, but had not yet been put into operation because of growing concerns about Russia and its activities in the Ukraine, but also out of technical reasons. But in the meantime, this gas pipeline has essentially been canceled. The permit for the pipeline has not been approved, and I don't see that it will be even in the future. What it's also meaning is that Europe is starting to rethink its gas policies. And so rather than increasing dependency on Russia, which was the plan with Nord Stream 2, instead, what we're going to see is a much stronger linking of European countries in their gas politics and the development of liquid natural gas terminals. Until now, there have been a few liquid natural gas terminals built in Europe, but the number is limited. And that means that the gas that can be imported from outside is also limited. We're seeing, going back to the previous slide, a plan to fill those coal and gas reserves. Coal is going to be either imported from other places like Australia or the United States. And gas is also to be increasingly imported from other locations, although there it's harder to import gas than it is coal. Coal you can transport easily by ship. Gas can only be transported by ship if it's in liquid natural gas form. We're also seeing new partnerships emerge, such as with Qatar, or the plans for a new pipeline linking Norway to the continent. So all of this is raising some big issues because it means that energy prices are going to be more and more expensive. And we haven't felt the full hit yet of this new set of politics, because the coal, for example, the shift is supposed to be completed by the 1st of August, and the new gas and oil politics are only just now beginning. There are some initial steps in various countries to try to provide financial support for low-income communities, but I think a big concern we should all have is the extent to which we have social unrest related to what is going on. And just a last comment before I switch to how this links into our larger concerns about climate change. You probably have seen that in the last week or so, the European Union has agreed on a partial embargo of oil. So that partial embargo has a bit of a loophole for Hungary. But essentially most oil is to be, oil imports from Russia are to be stopped by the end of this year. There's also related to the climate change program, but also what was going on in Ukraine, efforts at a new energy efficiency program. So here we start to see the link between climate change and the new gas and oil politics. And that is a stronger push than we've seen in the past on enhancing energy efficiency. And this is, if there is anything possible as a silver lining out of an absolutely horrific development in the Ukraine, it is that we may push forward on policies that are essential for climate change mitigation. So we are seeing new thinking going on in the European Union, as well as in various countries, on how to advance energy efficiency and to reduce demand. And we see various innovative developments on this front, everything from making public transportation cheaper so that people are more likely to get out of their cars and take public transportation, to programs where people are simply being asked to turn off appliances that are not needed. Electrification of the building sector, heating and cooling, as well as of transport, is something that is now more strongly in the visor than in the past. In part, that would also help us reduce our dependency on fossil fuels as long as it's linked, of course, to the development of more renewables. And smart metering is another thing that we are going to see more of in the time ahead. Particularly exciting, I think, for the climate area is the effort to speed up the development of renewables. And here I take the example of Germany, where there are plans to revise the Renewable Energy Policy Act to speed up the installation of photovoltaics, wind onshore, to achieve renewable electricity at an 80% level of supply by 2030 and 100% by 2035. This is a real speed up because with the previous government plans were 80% by 2050 for renewables. So we're seeing some push forward on trying to develop renewables at a level that we hadn't seen before. And tying in again to the climate change issue is the target for 2045 for climate neutrality, as well as 70 gigawatts of offshore wind. That would be a real big change from the levels of today. And I mentioned the oil embargo. So after long negotiations, the embargo of oil is to occur by the end of 22. Again, the exception of the pipeline to Hungary, which was agreed upon. And 2/3 of the Russian oil imported by the EU has been coming by tanker, 1/3 through the Druzhba pipeline. This is where we will see some big changes here. The oil being imported via tanker is going to be coming from other areas. The ban on the seaborne imports will be imposed with a phase-in period of 6 months for crude oil and 8 months for refined products. Now, all of this does relate very strongly to our CO2 emissions. Global CO2 emissions have been dramatically rising since the pre-industrial era. I always like this graph because it shows just really the takeoff of our CO2 emissions pretty much post-World War II, but also the rise of other countries in the mix sometime around the 1970s, 1980s. And now China is the world's largest emitter of CO2 emissions. If we look from a long-term perspective, what this means, our current level of CO2 emissions is something that, according to NASA, the National Atmospheric Association of the United States, we haven't seen this level of CO2 emissions in the past 800,000 years. And other data suggests we haven't seen it in the past 4 million years. As the war was breaking out, we also see the enhanced warnings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They came out with their 6th assessment report on the mitigation area. Impacts and mitigation have been the reports that are most recently released. And the reports basically are strong warning signs. The time to act is now. Systematic transformation is essential. We did see a slowdown in the growth of global CO2 emissions and the rate of that growth during the pandemic, but the emissions continue to rise. And essentially, if we still want to maintain a 1.5 degrees centigrade upper limit for a temperature change, then global CO2 emissions have to peak by 2025. And I'm just going to pause and emphasize that again. Global CO2 emissions must peak by 2025. And then they have to drop by 43% of 2019 levels by 2030. So if you think back at that other graph I was showing you, what we're talking about, the immense drop that we need to see globally in the shortest amount of time possible. So this, I think, is going to impact EU policies further. At the moment, the EU climate neutrality target is for 2050. Here too, we see some exemptions. Exemptions were made for Poland in terms of achieving climate neutrality at the domestic level. It's still a little bit unsure what this all means for the overall EU climate neutrality goal. But I think the bigger question is whether or not climate neutrality by 2050 is a sufficient goal given the developments that we're seeing internationally. The German Climate Change Act, I take that, I'm living in Germany, but this is an example. In 2019, a Climate Change Act had been agreed upon. In June 2021, a new government came in and amended that act. And what we're seeing with the amendment of this act are the target for climate neutrality being reduced to 2045. And we're also seeing midterm targets being established. You see those down below. So 88% lower CO2 emissions. So in 2011, we started to see some of the changes in European politics that are moving us in the direction of addressing climate emissions more actively. And one was the 2011 roadmap for a resource-efficient Europe. This roadmap proposed ways for how Europe can transform into a sustainable economy by 2050. And I think this is also an area that is quite relevant for what we're talking about, because although most of our CO2 emissions are coming from the energy sector and the transport sector, we also have the emissions that are associated with our resource use. So the fact that resource efficiency has become part of the discussion is, I think, quite central. We saw this also in the 7th Environmental Action Program in 2000, for the period 2013 to 2020. And here too, you see this emphasis on turning the European Union into a resource-efficient, green and competitive low-carbon economy. There are many ways that this is being discussed, everything from finding ways to enhance the implementation of existing legislation, as well as improving new legislation. Increasing knowledge, I think that's a theme I'll get back to in a minute, and securing investment for environment and climate policy. So we've seen a sustained interest in this area, you might say. But it brings us to the European Green Deal. And this is essentially the politics of today. And I think the European Green Deal will also be very heavily impacted by the war in the Ukraine. So the European Green Deal has numerous elements to it. You see the Zero Pollution Europe target, the transition to a circular economy, sustainable transport, clean, reliable, and affordable energy. My hope is that, again, if anything can be taken out of this war of the Ukraine that could soften its absolutely awful impacts, is that it might move us forward on achieving the European Green Deal targets. That's the hopeful scenario. The less hopeful scenario is that the costs of the war in the Ukraine and the rising prices of gas and oil will impact all of our economies quite heavily, and that this could also lead to some resistance to some of the plans, some of the changes. We have in the past already seen movements emerge, like in France, the Yellow Jackets that surfaced in opposition to an effort in France to raise the prices of gas. So this is a big concern, and that is why I think it will be critical for the European Union and all member states and all local regions to think about what can be done to soften the blow of this shock to the system, but at the same time continue with a transition towards a low carbon economy. The other big concern is on the financial side. The war in the Ukraine plus the increased investments in the military sector will, of course, mean there's less money for some other things, and we have to hope that this is not one of the areas that will be impacted. So the European Green Deal has climate neutrality for 2050 as a target, the circular economy, and the area 3, which I think will be much more in the visor in the months and years ahead, which is building renovation, since a large share of European use of fossil fuels is in the area of the building sector. I'm going to jump over some of these other targets. They're all important, but I wanted to show you a little bit what we do see going on. And one thing that we see going on is the development in renewables with some regions of Europe. I have the example here of Schleswig-Holstein in the north of Germany that are already obtaining 80% of their electricity from renewables with the plan for 100% by 2035. This is, of course, even less than Denmark. Denmark is ahead of Germany here, but it shows the potential that we have with wind energy in certain areas of Europe. Where I live in Bavaria, we don't see much in the way of wind. And this too is something where I think we're going to see some changes in policy. Bavaria has invested quite heavily in photovoltaics. You see an atlas here with all the locations of photovoltaic installations. That means that Bavaria is now getting 53% of its electricity from renewables, but that's much lower than Schleswig-Holstein, and it's absolutely not enough if we're to meet the targets that are being established at both the European and the national level. Sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background here as a truck goes by. The problem here is that there are laws that were introduced to block the development of wind turbines. So there's a 10 times distance rule compared to the height of the wind turbine that have been established. So you can't build a wind turbine that is within 10 times the length of the wind turbine to a building. That basically means that there are very few places here that you can build wind turbines. Many other countries have similar kinds of restrictions, and I think this is something we're going to see being tackled to try to make those new targets possible. And what that all means in terms of electricity production, again, I'm sorry, this is a little bit Germany focused here, but you see a very strong development of renewables here, but still a very heavy dependency on fossil fuels. And this is only the electricity sector. So clearly a lot more needs to be done. One area where I think we will also be seeing much more efforts is in the effort to find ways to store the electricity that is being produced. So this shows electricity production on a very windy day in February of 2020. And one of the sad things right now is that on a very windy day, not full capacity is used. A lot of wind turbines often end up being turned off because the grids are not able to transport all of the wind, and there's no place to send it to if there isn't enough demand for the wind or the electricity being produced at that time. You basically turn off your wind turbines. So one of the big questions is how can we use the capacity we already have also more efficiently? And there, the development of a more connected, interconnected European grid structure is one theme. A second theme will be the development of power to gas opportunities that will enhance storage, as well as intersector coupling, where you link the electricity sector and, for example, the transport sector more closely, where automobiles could help to store some of that extra electricity. Where are we in terms of reducing emissions? Well, in the German case, progress has been made. The same would be true for most European countries, but the big challenge will be getting down to this 2045 climate neutrality target. The path that we've been on is not sufficient yet. And that means that we really need to look not only at new policies, but how to implement them. The circular economy will be an important part of this. It's also important for other targets in Europe, such as biodiversity loss. 90% of global biodiversity loss is linked to resource extraction and processing. So here too, we see the potentials of shifting from the kind of linear economy that we have here to a more circular economy that we see here. And when we think about how much materials goes into the development or extraction of raw materials, whether that's water or energy, the transport associated with it, and then all the questions of how products are made, what they're made from, how they're distributed, how they're consumed, to what extent we use recycled materials or repaired materials, all of that will impact the amount of materials we are using in Europe, as well as the energy associated with them, the water associated with them, and the waste associated with them. So the circular economy package, it's been around for a while. The first one is 2015, and I'm just going to move forward and point out that here the push has been very much on looking at what industries can do to reduce their emissions, and that is everything from fossil fuels to resource. And also looking at what can be done with demand management. And that's something that's been very weak in Europe in the past, maybe not relative to other parts of the world, but it hasn't been a central part of the legislative focus. And I think here is something we will see a bigger push, how to reduce demand and improves the efficiency of how we use materials and energy. We're also seeing through the Green New Deal initiatives related to other products, such as plastics. In 2019, a ban was introduced on certain kinds of one-way plastics that were found on European beaches. So you have probably all already noticed that single-use plastic plates and cutlery, or the cotton buds you use to clean your ears, or straws and stirrers, have been banned. There are still a few places that are using the ones they had bought in the past, but in the future, they will not be available anymore. But also very importantly, that we're seeing efforts now to require producers to have a certain percentage of recycled materials in their beverage bottles or in other kinds of packaging. And I think that is moving us in the direction of more circular economy. Some industries in Europe are under double pressure right now. So take the chemical industry, for example. The chemical industry is very important to European economies. Europe is a big producer of chemicals, of petrochemicals. And that is a industry that is pretty energy intensive. It is also an industry that has links to a lot of other pollution issues. And although the industry has done a lot in the past already to clean its act, it's now under severe pressure. The price rise in the fossil fuel sector is going to hit this industry very hard, as well as, for example, the plastics ban or the recycling demands. But it's also an opportunity to push this and other industries into the new economy of the future. The circular economy package has in the meantime been further updated, modernized. The most recent editions or changes were made this year, 2022. And here you see that the idea of sustainable products are to become the norm in the European Union. Consumers and the public are to be empowered with more access to information. Eco-design laws are to be changed. And the eco-design laws will impact everything from energy efficiency to how products are designed, the materials that are available. A textile strategy has been developed, and I'll get back to that in a minute. And very importantly, we see construction product regulation. We don't think about it so often, but actually the construction industry is one of the biggest CO2 emitters in Europe. It's one of the biggest water users in Europe, and it produces the largest percentage of waste. And so the construction products regulation will be very important as an effort to try to reduce the waste associated with that industry. Resource-intensive industries are particularly being looked at, but also electronic products. And here, efforts to produce products that are longer lasting and easier to repair are part of the agenda. So I mentioned that there's also a textile strategy that's being developed. And here the strategy is for a greener, more competitive sector. And here too, you may not realize, but the textile sector is one of the most polluting sectors. It is using a lot of chemicals. It produces a lot of plastic waste because the polyester materials are essentially a kind of plastic. It's a huge waste issue. So Europe is trying to move away from fast fashion and to find a way that textiles can be produced with more recycled materials, as well as to be longer lasting and with a repair possibility. Various actions are being taken in relationship to this. And one of them is to introduce ways of providing digital passports for products. I think we're going to see this in many areas where digital technologies are going to be used to help us reach more efficiencies. And I'm getting to the end here. Eco-labeling is part of the whole development. In 2019, we already had 77,000 products carrying the European Union's eco-label. There are, of course, many other eco-labels as well. And in an effort to provide consumers with more ability to be sustainable in their consumption and production, actually in the consumption side, there's going to be a push to rethink how we do labeling. So just a couple of quick examples. I took some pictures to help illustrate some of the things we're talking about. You already know, of course, that plastic bottles have costs associated with them, so you can get your return on your plastic bottle. We're now moving towards recycled plastic. We're also starting to see much more information being put on packaging to help consumers understand what does it mean when you have a label that says it's an eco-label. Waste separation, I think you're going to see, is also going to be impacted in Europe. Here, I want to point out the bio-waste. The bio-waste is in some cities now being used to produce gas, natural gas. I think we're going to see a push to do much more bio-recycling in the future. And you'll see that areas like paper recycling, they work quite well, but in not all areas. So what we're seeing in Europe is that the recycling levels are higher for some than other areas. Packaging waste, a lot of that is recycled, but of course the amount is increasing. We see municipal waste. We're still at a far too low level in our recycling here. So that is something I think we're going to see changing. And electromobility. The push for electromobility in Germany, for example, means that by 2030, the goal is to have 10 million electric vehicles on the road. Whether or not the targets will be met is a big question. The 1 million target, which was for 2020, was not met. But now with what we see going on in the Ukraine, the question is maybe this will speed things up for this transition. I think I'll jump over here and just point out the other areas where we need to see much more change is usage of public transportation and bicycles. And certainly the Netherlands or Denmark are big examples of what can be done there. In my city where I live in Munich, we're starting to see more use of public transportation, more use of cycling, but there's still much to be done. And we also see here the example of Münster, the bicycle city. And as I come to an end and I think about what we're doing here in ICOS, the project associated with low carbon cities and how do we get there. I think the fact that the Green Deals are now starting to go local is also very relevant. All of those targets at the European level need to be brought down to the municipal level and to be thought through. How can we achieve climate neutrality in our cities? Europe has a plan for 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. That's only 8 years away, so a lot needs to be done there. And Munich's plan to be climate neutral by 2035 will now be pushed forward because it too has become one of these European cities for climate neutrality by 2030. So I think I'm going to stop here and just point out that there are other areas where we have waste, and we also need to be thinking about the food area, because here too a lot of energy and waste is produced. Battery ordinance, various policies and tools that we see in the European case. And now I bring my talk to an end. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you for this very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm waiting to see. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer, or if you have any comments or inputs from your own countries about this, I'd love to hear them.
I think we have a question from. Okay, I guess we didn't. So actually, I do have a question. Or okay, let's take Claudia's question first. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, Miranda. Well, thank you very much for this very, very interesting talk. And well, you touched on many, many topics, so quite a bit of information to take in. I would like to, well, coming back a little bit to the beginning of your talk about the import of fossil fuel, oil, coal from Russia, and the change we see based on the war in the Ukraine. My fear is always a little bit that things like this are popping up in the headlines in the media. It is very actual, you know, it is now everybody is talking about it, and then my fear is that over time it slips away again, and there was a lot of promises and a lot of change in the situation set, which then are just like shifted, and like the goals, we at the moment it feels like we decrease the climate goals in Europe. So it was, oh yeah, we have to be neutral by 2050, and now it is 2040, and suddenly it is 2030. But is this, in your opinion, something like which is happening here again, that now we are talking about it, it is present in the media, and then in 5 years' time, yeah, it is gone?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit pessimistic in that regard. Sorry to everybody.
I understand your concerns and your pessimism. It's hard not to be pessimistic in our field. It really is. But I think we have to do everything possible to remain focused on how we get there. And just the media has an up and down in its issue attention cycle. So it never stays sustained on any topic for very long. And I think one of the big challenges is how to keep the need for addressing climate change on the agenda. What does help is that we have a lot of legislative changes that are quite intense, they're quite effective. When Europe makes a change in policy, it usually impacts not just Europe, it impacts other countries. So any other region that wants to export to Europe needs to fulfill the new European standards. And so there's a ripple effect that after Europe introduces policies, we often see other countries introduce at least some elements of those policies. But your concern is real, and I don't really know if the world community understands yet what climate change really could mean. I think that there's a disconnect between reporting on climate change, where it tends to be focused on if we're not careful, we're going to have more forest fires, or we're going to have some extra hot days here and there. But I don't think most people understand what tipping points are, and that if the increase in temperature goes on in the way it's been going on, then we're going to hit points of dramatic change that will be sustained dramatic change, you know, the melting of the glaciers, for example. And there, I think, I just wrote a piece and I looked at what have we done in the last 50 years. If you look over the last 50 years, you can say, well, in a lot of areas we've made progress, but the problem is we don't have 50 years to tackle the climate change issue now and still meet the targets. So yes, I'm concerned like you, but I think the only thing we can do is to all work together to make sure that this topic stays on the agenda.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for this. So I was thinking, if everybody would sort of cooperate with you in a nice manner and nobody would sort of like oppose to it, then where would you start changing things?
Well, I think some of the changes we've seen started are going in the right direction. So one is the phasing out of coal. So coal is the most polluting of all of the fossil fuels, especially the brown coal, the lignite. We still use coal in Europe to produce electricity. That's a no-go. We basically need very, very rapidly to phase out the use of coal. We're moving in that direction, so that's good, that's helpful. I think that the war with Russia may speed us on in this direction a little bit. We may have a temporary greater use of coal, but we're also going to see a more rapid development of renewables. So I think that will help us to phase out the use of coal in the next 5 to 10 years, at least in several countries, maybe not in all European countries. And it's not just in Europe, it's also, you know, China or India, but there too, pressure to stop building new coal-fired power plants is big. So that's the first issue, I would say. The second issue, I would say, is we should all do everything possible to reduce energy demand, because that saves us money and it has a positive impact right away. Third is the build out of renewables. Every single new photovoltaic on the rooftops, more wind power, more wave power. There's lots of different kinds of renewables I think need to be pushed forward. And transport, reducing our use of automobiles and moving more towards public transportation and other means of transportation will be really important.
All good answers, I think. So what do you do in your personal life to reduce your carbon footprint?
I'm a vegetarian, so meat use, if you eat meat, you're using a lot of fossil fuels, and you are contributing to deforestation because of the use of land for cattle farms. So vegetarian. I bicycle. I don't have a car, so I bicycle everywhere, and I use public transportation everywhere. I turn off my refrigerator in the month of November, and I put my food into a little refrigerated box out on the porch. I've managed to bring my personal kilowatt usage way down. So I'm about at a quarter of the normal level for a single person. But I still flew. I came back from the US yesterday, and that's where you have a really bad CO2 footprint. And I haven't figured out how I can get to the United States and visit my family unless I fly.
Have you tested taking the boat?
No, but I Zoom. Corona helped us learn that you can have these kinds of meetings virtually, and that will reduce the amount of flying, I think, that goes on for business meetings. It might not change people's personal travel habits in all areas, but it might help us in some areas.
True. Claudia has a second question, I guess. Or should we give it to Maria? Go ahead.
Hi, yes, hello. I was wondering, kind of a question regarding maybe political culture, like we've seen the European countries come together quite remarkably with the sanctions and as a reaction to the Ukraine war. Could this kind of ethos help us become more unified in climate policies?
I hope so, and I think so. In fact, the impact is so intense that we're going to see a much stronger European energy policy than we've seen in the past. So in the past, the decentralization, the idea of sovereignty in energy decisions was still very strong in Europe. I think because of the war in the Ukraine and the need to react as a bloc, you're going to see a much stronger effort to interconnect countries, and that can help with the efficiency of the use of our renewables, for example. And I think we'll see more coordinated decisions related to energy questions. So yes, I'm thinking we're going to see more cooperation on the energy front. And energy policy is very much climate policy. So what we do with energy is basically also how we're relating to the climate change problem. Unfortunately, both with Corona, the COVID time, and now with the Ukraine war, the European Union's response has always integrated climate into the response related to COVID. So the relief spending related to COVID has targeted a lot of areas that are beneficial for climate policy. And with the Ukraine war, the push on renewables and energy efficiency also suggests that. So I'm hoping yes, But if we have a lot of right-wing movements emerge, and if we see a lot of populism in the next months and years as a result of higher energy prices, that could, of course, break apart.